There's a moment you don't talk about, not because it's dramatic or harrowing, but because it's too ordinary, so common it slips under your skin without protest. It's the moment you find yourself silently seething at someone's behavior. Maybe they're loud and self-congratulatory, maybe they interrupt too much, or they're always late, or they twist words. You smile politely, but something in you churns. Later you replay it, annoyed, even disgusted, unsure why such a small thing stirred something so deep. And then, just like that, it passes. You convince yourself it's nothing. They're just annoying, you say. You move on, or so you think. But irritation never travels alone. It clings to something more intimate, a hidden thread that ties what you despise in others to something unresolved in yourself. You weren't just reacting to them. You were reacting to something inside you being touched, poked, awakened. But to look at that honestly, that takes courage. Because it means facing a version of yourself you've long tried to outrun. You've built a life on appearing composed. You learned how to smile through offense, deflect with charm, stay above the mess. You've become good at labeling others. Toxic, narcissistic, immature, without realizing you're pointing at the edges of your own shadow. And when the same type of person keeps showing up in different clothes, in different years, under different names, you don't stop to ask why. You just call it bad luck. Or worse, the world's fault. But you're tired. Tired of being hijacked by emotions you don't fully understand. Tired of reacting and then regretting. Tired of how certain people seem to take up too much space inside your mind, long after they've left the room. Tired of how often your peace is disturbed by someone else's flaws. And deeper still, you're tired of wondering whether these flaws might live in you too. No one taught you that irritation could be a mirror, that what you judge in others might be a message to yourself, not about them, but about you. No one showed you that growth doesn't always feel like inspiration. Sometimes it feels like a sting. Sometimes it starts with annoyance. So here you are, again, at the edge of some discomfort you can't explain. This is not the time to retreat. This is the time to look closer. Because everything that irritates you about others, it might be the very thing that can set you free, if you let it. Now breathe. You're not alone in this. You're just beginning. Maybe you've been taught that irritation is just a reflex, an automatic, almost biological response to bad behavior. That people get under your skin because they're wrong, rude, or simply incompatible with your values. You've been led to believe that your emotional reactions are always justifiable, that discomfort equals danger, and that anything which disturbs your sense of peace must be pushed away, labeled, or exiled. After all, boundaries are sacred, right? But what if the truth is the opposite? What if irritation isn't a warning about them, but a revelation about you? What if the very traits you find intolerable in others are echoes of something unresolved in yourself? This doesn't mean you're just like them, or that their behavior is acceptable. It means the charge, the intensity with which you respond, might have more to do with your own inner conflict than their outer behavior. It's not a comfortable idea. In fact, it can feel like betrayal. You've worked hard to become a certain kind of person. You've curated your identity around what you are not. You pride yourself on being humble, so arrogance disgusts you. You value honesty, so manipulation enrages you. You strive to be self-aware, so the blind spots of others seem unbearable. But underneath all that moral pride lives a possibility. What if you're not reacting to their flaws, but to your own fear of having them? You were never taught to sit with that fear. You were taught to perform goodness, to manage perception, to fix others instead of questioning yourself. Somewhere along the way, you began building your sense of self on rejection. I am not like that. But in doing so, you created a fragile self-image, one that can only exist by casting out what it fears becoming. Carl Jung understood this well. He spoke of the shadow, the rejected parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. Not because they're evil, but because they don't fit our idea of who we are. And so, we banish them. We lock them in the basement of our psyche and pretend they're not there. but they don't disappear. They haunt us in the faces of others. We call them irritating, but what they really are is familiar. You think you're bothered by that person's arrogance, but maybe you're afraid of your own need to be seen. You think you can't stand their emotional outbursts, but maybe you've buried your own too deep. You think you hate how controlling they are, but maybe there's a part of you that craves control more than you admit. This is not about self-blame. It's about self-integration. It's about breaking the cycle of projection. The moment you stop pointing outward and start turning inward, everything changes. Not because the world becomes less irritating, but because you begin to see what the irritation is trying to show you. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." It sounds simple, almost too poetic to carry the weight it does. But behind those words is a blueprint for inner revolution, a path toward becoming whole. Because in Jung's view, the soul's deepest longing is not to be pure or perfect, but to be integrated, to welcome the parts of ourselves we've disowned, judged, or forgotten. The human psyche, Jung believed, is not a linear story. It is a living system made of contradictions. Your light coexists with your shadow. Your tenderness lives beside your rage. Your generosity neighbors your envy. And your irritation is not some moral failing. It's a clue, a whisper from the unconscious, pointing to the place you've yet to reconcile. Jung called this the shadow self, not because it is evil, but because it has been kept in the dark. These are not necessarily wicked traits. They are simply the ones that your conscious identity rejected. Maybe you were raised to be nice, so your anger was cast aside. Or maybe you were taught to be strong, so your vulnerability was buried. Over time, your personality formed by exclusion. You became who you are by hiding who you were not allowed to be. But the psyche does not forget. The shadow lives on. And when you meet someone who embodies what you've suppressed, irritation arises. Not because they're objectively wrong, but because they force your unconscious into the light. The parts of yourself you locked away, they recognize themselves in others. And the recognition is uncomfortable. So you defend, you judge, you distance. You say, "That's not me." But in doing so, you close the door on self-awareness. Jung's insight was radical, not because it accused people of hypocrisy, but because it offered liberation. It suggested that what annoys you may hold the very key to your own becoming. The shadow isn't here to shame you, it's here to complete you. Jung saw psychological health not as the eradication of flaws, but as the harmony of opposites. Integration means saying, "Yes, I am capable of impatience, of control, of neediness. And that doesn't make me unworthy, it makes me human." Until you can say this, you will keep chasing peace by trying to purify the world around you, when what really needs your attention is within. The invitation Jung offers is not to eliminate the irritating parts of others, but to inquire, why does this disturb me so deeply? What have I not yet accepted in myself? The goal is not to love every difficult person. The goal is to become so whole that they no longer steal your clarity. This is not absence. This is presence. This is the start of seeing yourself not as fragmented, but as something waiting to be remembered. Think about how often it happens, quietly, almost automatically. You're in a meeting and someone dominates the conversation with shallow confidence. Your stomach tightens. You scroll through social media and someone's overly curated life triggers a flicker of resentment. You call it arrogance. You call it fake. But something deeper is stirred. Not because they're doing anything to you, but because they've touched something in you you'd rather not feel. Or maybe it happens closer to home. A friend cancels plans again, and you're filled with disproportionate anger. You tell yourself it's about respect, but is it also about feeling rejected? Is it the echo of being overlooked once again? Is the irritation just a flare, warning you of some old wound being reopened? This is how it works. The shadow doesn't knock. It seeps through the minor, the mundane, the moments you think you've rationalized and outgrown. It uses other people as mirrors, showing you the parts of yourself that you haven't yet welcomed home. But because it feels easier to label than to look inward, you keep recycling the same conflicts, just with different names and faces. It's why you notice certain traits over and over. It's not that the world is full of these people. It's that your soul is drawing your attention to something unfinished. That coworker who micromanages every task? Maybe she's touching your unspoken fear of losing control. That friend who always needs validation? Maybe he's reflecting the part of you that still aches to be seen. And it's not just individual relationships. This pattern plays out in groups, families, systems. Families that pride themselves on being peaceful often suppress anger, only to later be ruled by passive aggression. Teams that boast transparency may react harshly to dissenting opinions, because real vulnerability threatens their controlled image. Even cultures can project their shadow onto outsiders, demonizing what they secretly envy or fear. Jung understood that until a person makes the unconscious conscious, it will direct their life, and they will call it fate. That's what projection is, the unconscious running your emotional life in disguise. You think you're just frustrated with a person, but you're actually in conversation with your shadow, and that shadow won't go away just because you avoid it. It will keep showing up until you pay attention. To live unconsciously is to move through life reacting, defending, explaining, and blaming. But to live consciously is to pause, right at the moment of irritation, and ask, what is this really about? You stop trying to control the world. You start trying to understand yourself. You may not always like what you find, but that's not the point. The point is to become whole, not comfortable, not righteous, not untouchable, but fully awake to your own complexity. Only then can you walk through this world without needing it to bend for your peace, because your peace will be coming from within. So how do you begin to change? Not by force, but by awareness. How do you take that fleeting moment of irritation and turn it into a doorway rather than a wall? The truth is, this kind of transformation doesn't come from trying to fix yourself. It begins with learning how to listen, deeply, honestly, without flinching. First, pause in the moment of disturbance. When someone says something that makes your chest tighten or your jaw clench, resist the instinct to judge or defend. Instead, just notice. Say to yourself, this is the moment. That tension? That's not an enemy. That's the edge of your awareness. Stay with it. Let yourself feel what rises. Not the story about them, but the feeling within you. Then ask the hard question. What does this say about me? Not in self-accusation, but in self-inquiry. Maybe you're angry because you feel dismissed. Maybe you feel envy because they dare to express something you were taught to repress. Maybe you're judging their neediness because you were never allowed to have needs. Let the irritation guide you, not toward their flaws, but toward your own forgotten tenderness. Next, bring compassion to whatever you uncover. Jung didn't say that your shadow is shameful, only that it's unknown. The parts of yourself that you've exiled are still you. They are not moral failures. They are survival patterns, hidden truths, misfit longings. They were pushed away because they didn't feel safe to express. Now, as an adult, you have the power to say, I see you. You belong here. This is not weakness. This is self-leadership. Another practice, stop labeling people so quickly. Instead of thinking, she's so controlling, try, I feel controlled when I'm around her. Why? Shift from reaction to reflection. The moment you stop narrating others and start investigating yourself, you reclaim your energy. You stop outsourcing responsibility for your peace. You begin to see how often you've handed over your power, not to people, but to your own resistance to growth. Lastly, make peace with complexity. You will still be irritated. You will still judge. But now each of those moments becomes a signal, not a sentence. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be curious. Growth isn't about eliminating the shadow. It's about becoming intimate with it. The more honest you are with your own humanity, the less threatened you'll feel by the humanity of others. This is not about being cold. It's about choosing peace. It's about reclaiming your emotional life from reflex and placing it gently into the hands of consciousness. You're not trying to transcend the messy parts of yourself. You're trying to include them. And in doing so, you stop being ruled by what you cannot see. You start becoming someone who responds instead of reacts. Someone who creates space inside, even when the world presses in. But not everything that looks like growth is truly growth. In the age of emotional language and curated self-awareness, it's easy to confuse performance with transformation. You learn to say the right things. I'm just setting boundaries. I've outgrown that energy. I'm protecting my peace. And sometimes these are honest expressions, but other times they are masks, more elegant than the ones you used to wear, but masks nonetheless. You begin to mimic the posture of healing without letting it touch the deeper places inside you. You call someone toxic, not because they are, but because they've triggered a part of you you haven't faced. You walk away from discomfort, claiming self-respect, when really it's just self-avoidance in prettier clothes. You talk about energy and alignment and vibration, but what you avoid is accountability. Your own emotional reactions, your own patterns, your own unfinished work. This is what Jung would call shadow inflation, when a person believes they've confronted their darkness simply because they've named it. But naming is not integrating. You can recite every psychological term, but unless you feel the tremble of recognition in your gut, the raw honesty of saying, "This trait I despise might be in me too," you haven't begun the work. You've only dressed your ego in spiritual language. And this false imitation can be seductive. It makes you feel in control. It allows you to separate from others under the guise of awareness. But real awareness is humbling. It doesn't make you feel above anyone. It makes you feel tender toward everyone, especially those who reflect the very things you're learning to hold inside yourself. Beware of the impulse to weaponize insight. Not every person who irritates you is projecting. Not every conflict is a mirror. Sometimes people are simply wrong for you. But if you reach for that explanation every time, you miss the opportunity to examine the role you've played, not to blame yourself, but to grow yourself. And don't confuse withdrawal with wisdom. Isolation isn't always a sign of evolution. Sometimes it's just fear disguised as discernment. Sometimes you cut people off not because they're bad, but because they've cracked open a part of you you're still trying to bury. Be honest with yourself about this. Spiritual bypassing doesn't just delay healing, it calcifies the very wounds you're trying to escape. The deeper you go, the more subtle the ego becomes. It learns your language. It adapts. It hides behind growth and calls it completion. But Jung's path was never about becoming untouchable. It was about becoming whole. Wholeness isn't shiny. It's real. It's raw. It means letting go of the need to always look enlightened, and instead, letting yourself be human, flawed, and profoundly unfinished. So be cautious. Not everything that shines is light. Not everything that feels calm is peace. And not everything that sounds evolved is true. The real path of self-understanding is quieter than you think. It's not a declaration. It's a question you ask yourself, again and again, every time someone or something presses into your soul. Am I willing to see what this is showing me? Something begins to shift when you stop asking, "Why are they like this?" and start asking, "Why does this stir something in me?" It's subtle at first, just a pause, a breath, a softening around your usual defenses. You still feel the irritation, the flush of anger, the reflex to judge, but now there's space around it. You don't fall into it so quickly. You don't build stories so fast. You've started to turn inward. You've begun to listen to the language of your shadow. This is the moment of reconstruction, not of personality, but of self. Because the you who needed to be pristine, composed, unaffected, that version of you is growing old. It served a purpose. It kept you safe. But it's not who you're becoming. Who you're becoming doesn't need to divide the world into saints and villains. Who you're becoming doesn't need to win every moral argument or prove spiritual superiority. Who you're becoming is not afraid of contradiction. The real you is not built on rejection. It's built on reintegration. You start to gather what was once scattered. You realize that anger, when honored rather than feared, becomes clarity. That envy, when owned, becomes direction. That judgment, when held with tenderness, becomes understanding. What once looked like flaws now feel like invitations to explore, to embrace, to evolve. There is a kind of power that arises when you stop needing others to change in order for you to feel whole. It's not a loud power. It doesn't dominate a room. It's quieter, deeper. It allows you to sit across from someone who triggers you and still remain present. Not because you're numb, but because you've built a wider home inside yourself. There's room now for you, for them, for the truth between you. And this reconstruction doesn't mean you tolerate harm. It means you no longer confuse discomfort with danger. You can tell the difference. You're not leaking projection onto every situation. You're not carrying ancient wounds into new encounters. You've taken responsibility, not as a burden, but as a liberation. You've stopped waiting for others to be different so that you can finally be at peace. You begin to notice your own shadow when it flares up, when it retreats, when it whispers stories into your ear. And instead of silencing it, you invite it closer. You say, I know you. I've spent a lifetime pretending you weren't part of me, but you are. And I'm ready now to carry you differently. This is not transcendence. This is return. This is the moment the fractured parts of you begin to speak again. Not in accusation, but in reunion. You've stepped out of the role of judge and into the role of witness. And from this place, you no longer fear your reflection in others. You welcome it because you know it's not a threat. It's a sign that you are at last becoming whole. So here you are now, standing not in certainty, but in presence. The world hasn't quieted. People still interrupt, overstep, disappoint. But something in you has changed. You no longer meet irritation with the same urgency, the same sharpness. It still visits, yes, but now it feels less like an enemy and more like a messenger. You've learned to listen before you react. You've learned to look inward before you point outward. You've stopped outsourcing your peace to the behavior of others. You've stopped waiting for perfect environments and flawless people to prove that you've healed. Because healing, you now understand, doesn't mean that nothing hurts. It means that when it does, you no longer abandon yourself. You stay. You breathe. You ask, what is this really about? And in that asking, you reclaim the part of you that was trying to speak all along. This doesn't make you immune to pain, but it makes you honest with it. You can hold your reactions gently now without being consumed by them. You can say, that annoyed me, and then ask, why? Not as a judgment, but as an act of curiosity. The people who once triggered you become less powerful, not because they've changed, but because you've stopped giving them the keys to your inner world. This is not coldness. This is clarity. You don't need to exile parts of yourself anymore. You don't need to prove you're above it all. You don't need to perform maturity. You just need to be here with all of it. The tension, the tenderness, the edges. Wholeness was never about becoming a perfected self. It was about learning how to sit with the mess, the contradictions, the discomfort, and still say, this is me too. Carl Jung's insight was never meant to shame you for your judgments. It was an invitation to see them not as failure, but as feedback. To understand that what disturbs you in others is a doorway to what's unfinished in you. And now you've walked through that doorway. You've faced the reflections. You've held the mirror steady. And in doing so, you've begun the sacred, difficult, liberating work of becoming whole. So now you make a vow, not out loud, not to the world, but to yourself. A vow to pause before reacting, to question before condemning, to soften where you once tightened, to stay where you once fled. You promise to carry your shadow not as a shame, but as a compass. You promise to stop splitting yourself between who you are and who you think you should be. You promise to let irritation become insight. You promise to let judgment become gentleness. You promise to let this be the path back to you.